Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to the program. I'm Adnan Husain, and this is Office Hours. So I hope people are excited to drop in, have a chat. It's a casual Friday weekly live stream that I've been doing. And they've been really fun and really interesting. And I've had a great group of guests. And that is indeed the case today as well. Before I have my guest introduce herself, I just want to ask you if you're on the stream to like this video, like the stream. Maybe you can share it on your media, social media and platforms. As I like to say, don't be miserly with interesting knowledge. You're not going to get perspectives like this everywhere, and share it, be socialist about the knowledge. So put it on your platforms, let your friends, colleagues, and others know about it. And you can also subscribe to the channel so that you get updates about this. And if you can, I'd prefer you give the money to Gaza. And in fact, we probably will talk a little bit about some very important causes you could support to be in solidarity with political prisoners, with the people in Gaza who are suffering forced starvation and genocide and so on. But if you like to keep this media platform and public education project going, you can, of course, make a contribution at patreon.com/Adnan Husain. But without further ado, I'm really excited because I've been wanting to have this conversation and discussion with my guest for Office Hours for months, maybe you could say a couple of years. So I'm really delighted to welcome Calla Walsh to Office Hours. Thanks so much for making time, Calla.
Salam. Thank you for having me, Adnan. It's good to see you again. I can just introduce myself quickly.
Yeah, please
give
do.
a little
Tell
bit
us
of my
about
background,
yourself.
I guess. I'm 21. I'm an organizer, a writer, and journalist, which I think some people were surprised to hear me call myself, but I have published my writing in various places for a few years, and I'm leaning more into that as a path. People know me for having a background in the Democratic Party, and my trajectory has been a pretty rapid radicalization, I would say, since I was first involved at like 15. I went through DSA, which I left for its Zionism and propping up of politicians supporting the genocide in Palestine in 2021. I worked on various electoral campaigns and then kind of broke with that world and shifted more into community organizing, direct action, internationalism as forms of struggle. I was the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba for 2 years, which is a coalition of over 70 Cuba solidarity orgs fighting to lift the blockade. And that's when we last spoke, I believe, was when I was on Guerrilla History with you in like 2023 about our campaign to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list, which of course Biden did in the last days of his term so that Trump could immediately reverse it, just using Cuba as a punching bag in US politics per usual. And then after the Al-Aqsa flood, I was part of the founding of PAL Action US, bringing the PAL Action direct action campaign against Elbit Systems to the US. And that was active for about 6 weeks before I was arrested, along with 2, later 3 other people facing felony charges, up to 37 years in prison. We were given no contact orders. We were / still are under federal investigation, and we're facing those charges for about a year until we served a jail sentence at the end of last year. I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting, but I think that is a good summary of my background. Oh, you're muted still.
Sorry. Oh, it's a good start, and I think we'll want to come back to quite a few of those things and talk in maybe more detail about some of them. Um, but I wanted to maybe come back to from our last conversation, we were talking about solidarity with Cuba, and you were involved with the Venceramos Brigades, a solidarity organization, and had taken a trip to Cuba. And we were talking about how Cuba had been placed on the state sponsoring terrorism list. And I just wondered, what did you kind of learn about that experience in terms of U.S. Kind of foreign policy and the way in which solidarity work could be conducted, both to do political pressure, but also educate people by having a kind of a trip and publicizing your kind of action and what you learned, in Cuba. It was a really interesting experience, it seems.
Yeah, I hope everyone has a chance to visit Cuba at some point. It is one of the most incredible places I've ever been, despite being under the most prolonged and extreme economic sanctions in the world. There is still so much revolutionary optimism there, although the situation is increasingly very, very desperate. I first went to Cuba when I was 17 in 2022, right after COVID. And I think in that time it was especially stark, just the difference in how Cuban society is structured and how, despite spending so much less on their healthcare system, having so much less money in general, being under such dire conditions, took such better care of their population during the entire pandemic, of course, despite the US exploiting that to manufacture regime change attempts like on July 11th. Since then, I've been back to Cuba 3 other times. My latest trip was this spring, which of course I spoke about publicly once I got back, about being detained and interrogated and having my phone seized coming back. But that kind of intimidation is very normal in the entire history of Cuba solidarity organizing since the Cuban Revolution. You mentioned the Venceremos Brigade. I've actually never been on the Venceremos Brigade. The one I've helped organize is the May Day Brigade with the National Network on Cuba, which goes every single year. If anyone's interested in going, I recommend they check that out. There's already an interest form for 2026. But people used to travel to Cuba on freight boats from Canada or fly to France and then Czechoslovakia to fly to Cuba. And their parents would get followed and intimidated by the FBI upon their return. So I think the biggest, the important thing about these trips is that it's building people to people connections. It is in defiance of sanctions. It's not illegal to travel to Cuba, but it is still, like, I see it as a kind of direct action against sanctions, since the US does add all these extra obstacles to make people think that they can't go there or that it's too dangerous. They don't want us to see the reality both of the incredible achievements of Cuban socialism, but also the horrific genocidal consequences of US sanctions. And so that is why they also intimidate people upon coming back. But I think going to sanctioned countries, doing direct exchanges is really important to normalize these kind of relations, to learn about the reality there, and most importantly, not as, like saviorism of people in the US helping Cuba. Like, we support Cuba not because it's weak, but because it actually, it does pose a threat to the US in terms of what Cuba represents. Like, I'm not saying Cuba poses any threat to the US militarily, because the US uses that as justification for its aggression, but the Cuban Revolution and what it represents, crushing imperialism, building an alternative 90 miles away from the US, that is a huge threat that has to be crushed. And that is why I think the blockade, will exist so long as US imperialism exists, or so long as the Cuban Revolution exists. Like, one has to go. And that is the whole point of the blockade. It's a regime change strategy. So was Obama's lifting of sanctions. That was also a regime change strategy in a different form. And so in all these negotiations and in our advocacy, we have to remember that, and that it is a bipartisan blockade. It's not just Trump and Rubio. All these sanctions were upheld by Biden, and that even when Obama was lifting them, it was because he wanted to try to change the Cuban government in a different way, by showing them how great US democracy was. a lot of the repression is escalating on Cuba. I mean, they're sanctioning officials from African countries, from Caribbean countries for receiving Cuban medical brigades. And they're really trying to crush that program because it is a lifeline for the Cuban economy, of course. But we need to continue to support Cuba to fight against the sanctions and to lift the blockade. I think one of my personal takeaways from a lot of this advocacy is that doing it in Congress can be very soul crushing, and that is not necessarily where change is made. I think bringing people to Cuba, educating people in our communities about the Cuban Revolution and the kind of structures it uses to support its people, that is an approach that I've moved towards. Since also spending, time in Congress, getting arrested in Bob Menendez's office, protesting the blockade, et cetera. And so there are a wide variety of strategies and tactics that are used to organize for Cuba. And I think when I was in Iran, another very sanctioned country, another country falsely designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, I was comparing the two a lot, not to jump ahead and get into that, but Cuba is a small island of 11 million people, and it doesn't have its own oil or gas. And so the economy is really strangled in a way that in Iran, they have a development capacity and industry that Cuba doesn't. And so Cuba is reliant on trade and imports and exports from other countries. And the US blockade is extraterritorial, so it is able to punish even other countries for helping Cuba. But the same fear that people had, about me going to Iran, going to Cuba, that is what these sanctions and these terrorism designations are meant to instill in people, is fear, is self-policing, changing our own behavior, when actually still traveling to these places is perfectly legal and fine. And no matter how much you might get harassed coming back, I'm a US citizen, they had to let me back in. So that wasn't something that I was scared of, but it is something I've noticed in the movement, not only with countries and foreign entities that are designated with these terrorist designations, but also domestic resistance groups, for lack of a better term, such as Pal Action, such as Samidun, also being hit with these designations to instill fear-mongering and to change people's behavior and get them to kind of have this chilling effect and distance from designated entities or countries.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely want to talk a lot more about the chilling effect and repression of political movements. That this is one component. The designation of terrorism, is used uh, almost more than any prosecutions under it, but to chill political solidarity and action. It was interesting when you were talking about the importance of these people-to-people exchanges, and I think that's something that's just so important because so many people in the United States don't travel much, can't afford to travel, haven't been given the opportunity to travel. There's also an insularity to our culture that people think, well, whatever exists is something that's portrayed and represented in our own cultural forms, and that people from all over the world come here. So they think and imagine that they have access somehow to the realities of other societies, which we don't, through our media, which does a perfectly good job of not necessarily of informing us about the rest of the world, but disinforming us about it often. And so it's so important to actually have real relations and testimonies and experience, not only because you can see and bring back kind of knowledge and experience, but also just, I think this politics was, really relies upon understanding and actually feeling the humanity of others who are not necessarily living with you in your society. And so much of what we probably will want to talk about as well, about the genocide in Gaza, for example, really is only possible because of the rendering of others inhuman. So that's really struck me of how important some of those exchanges and meetings are for political education. And in terms of the sanctions, I mean, has any country been subjected to the same level of sanctions over such a long period of time as Cuba? We did an episode with Helen Yaffe about sanctions on Cuba, an article that she had written in the Sanctions as War collection, and as part of that series on guerrilla history. So I would encourage people to go get more specific information about what you were just mentioning about the devastating effect and consequences of the sanctions. But in terms of this, and I'm hoping myself, I've never actually been to Cuba myself, but I'm hoping to go maybe this February. And so I'm really excited by the encouragement that you're giving people to, make the effort. I think it's going to be really worthwhile. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about, your involvement in Palestine solidarity and how and when that started, and was it more a function of broadly taking an anti-imperialist stance, or did you have another avenue into the long-term solidarity that you've had in activism for Palestine? And maybe, it would be interesting to hear your analysis about why, because there are a lot of other, genocides going on. People point out, in Sudan, and of course, people ignored the genocide that was taking place, really the invasion, the worst humanitarian crisis for a period of time, by the brave Yemeni people, who were subjected to these Gulf monarchies and ZioAmerican imperialist-backed invasion. But those often don't get the same kind of maybe political attention of people who are involved in anti-imperialist solidarity. And so, for you, how and why is Palestine such an important issue, and what is it kind of reflective of in the larger kind of politics and activism that you have and that you would advocate?
Yeah, I think understanding Palestine is a door to understanding imperialism in every corner of the world. And I think it is some of the most extreme examples of its imperialism's brutality and brazenness, but it is certainly not an aberration of this history whatsoever. It's not any aberration from the long, long history of genocide and conquest and settler colonialism that is part of this world system of imperialism. Particularly where I live in the United States, where you live in Canada, this process of genocide and displacement has been taking place for hundreds of years. And why Palestine is so acute is that it's still in this kind of frontier stage. The timeline is different. But again, it's not different than these other places. But it is the most live streamed, most documented genocide in the history of this world. And for me, I think 2020, participating in the uprising in 2020, being in the streets then was truly the most radicalizing thing that ever happened to me, and that changed my politics. I was in the streets realizing, oh, we have to fight the police. Like, we have to overthrow this illegitimate government that is occupying this land that we live on. But it wasn't until 2021 that I really became involved in Palestine solidarity, and that became really central to my political work. And I think 2020 really helped set the stage for the amount of support that Palestine got in 2021 during the Six-Day War, during the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, and the resistance from Gaza and the genocidal attacks in response. It was a huge shift in consciousness that had taken place in 2020, that like tens of thousands of people were in the streets, even in 2021 for Palestine in Boston, where I grew up, something that people had never seen before around here. And after that, I realized I'd been complicit in a party, the Democratic Party, carrying out a genocide. I'd always been like on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and pushing the Democratic Party to the left. But what I realized was that even the most self-proclaimed progressive, pro-peace, anti-war Democrats are still complicit in Zionism and ultimately just trying to reform U.S. imperialism. I was also in the DSA at this time, and kind of realized the futility of trying to change the Democratic Party from within. And I felt, as a young person, I was like 16 or 17 at this time, I felt the need to also publicly self-criticize and make kind of a public intervention about how my ideology has shifted since I'd upheld these candidates. I'd upheld this party at a young age, and therefore I had a duty to self-criticize for that, to explain what led me to changing my views. And my position was basically like, we need to shift away from electoralism and from further legitimizing an illegitimate genocidal system and participating in it. And we need to make a break from it. And we need to build our own structures to resist it and attack it and dismantle it and build something new. But still, like, it took until the Al-Aqsa flood, it took and the Palestinian resistance doing a prison break by land, air, and sea, taking back their stolen lands, for me to also really shift what I was doing, like strategically, tactically, because I was still very much in kind of reformist tactics, working in NGOs, not just volunteering, but also as a career path. I kind of felt like the most effective way I could do political work was if it was also my job, which now I think is not the case at all, at least not in the nonprofit industrial complex. But anyways, that's how I was thinking. And the Al-Aqsa flood putting armed struggle back on the table changed that immediately. Like, I think all the escalation that I think is necessary now was also necessary well before this, because the genocide has been happening for over 75 years. It didn't start on October 7th or after October 7th. But we were in the streets then, not just because of the genocide, but because of the resistance, because of the armed struggle. And I think we need to really uphold that. We can't just talk about Palestinians dying. We have to talk about Palestinians resisting and understand that the Al-Aqsa flood was a preemptive strike, and it was, an operation to shatter this myth of Israel and the U.S., like their invincibility, to show that these entities are weaker than a spider's web, to use the words of the martyr Syed Hassan Nasrallah. And so we then launched Pal Action US, and I'm, again, kind of getting ahead of myself, but I think we really need to interrogate like this framework we have of thinking of ourselves as a solidarity movement. The solidarity movement framework is kind of, it's ahistorical. That is not, how international revolutionaries or the Palestinian diaspora necessarily conceptualized themselves before Oslo. But with Oslo, with the NGOization, both of movements here and also movements and social movements and infrastructure in Palestine, as well as the creation of these terror lists and designations, all this, the severing of ties between the resistance organizations in Palestine and in the axis of resistance countries, their severing of ties and of solidarity with international people because of all these sanctions and designations, et cetera, really shifted how we think of ourselves. And I think that the solidarity movement framework is really passive. I think it kind of frames us as people here sitting around, like, and the people over there in Palestine are the ones fighting and the ones dying, and all we can do is like sit here and maybe protest, but that resistance is only something that takes place far away, this abstract thing far away, and not something that can take place here. But to get back to what I was saying in the beginning, like, why is Palestine so central, is because it exposes all the contradictions of the United States. Like, we live in an Israel, and it's hundreds of years later, down in the process of genocide and displacement of Indigenous people. And that's not to say Indigenous people like don't exist here or have been erased. Of course they haven't. There is still, lots of Indigenous organizing and resistance here. But the US has consolidated its rule from sea to shining sea, and everything that the US is now doing abroad, all of its foreign military bases, all of its foreign interventions, all of those tactics were first used on African and Indigenous people here. It's not this like imperial boomerang coming back to bite us. These tactics were invented here, and they're what inspired the Nazis and inspired the Zionists and so on. So I think we have a huge contradiction that we need to deal with in the so-called Palestine solidarity movement, which is, are we this kind of like detached single issue movement, which is really, when you look at it, like a conglomerate of NGOs and then like thousands and thousands of people who go to protest and take part in resistance, but don't necessarily have leadership or a path to more sustained resistance or escalated action. Because of course, NGOs aren't going to lead militant action that goes against the very interests of their own structure. But are we this, kind of detached single issue movement, or are we trying to build a anti-imperialist movement and a revolution here? Like, are we building a revolution here, or are we a movement of NGOs? And I think those are two very different things. I don't know if I'm articulating that in like the most precise way, but I think that is a really core contradiction. And that's how the uprising in 2020 was co-opted, was that it was kind of watered down to like single issueism and NGOs, and the militant resistance in the streets was crushed, and the political prisoners who are still locked up, hundreds of them, for taking part in that uprising, have been forgotten about, and people have moved on. So I worry about the same kind of counterinsurgency taking hold. I mean, I think it already has taken hold well before this, with, like I said, all this NGOization. And we see that particularly with groups that support a two-state solution or condemn the armed resistance, and go out of their way to police other groups in the movement that are more militant. For example, like the BDS National Committee, they were teeing Samidun up for this designation for years, convincing other groups Samidun was too dangerous to work with, putting out statements telling people to never praise the armed resistance or name, said resistance groups, etc. And so I think there's a lot of like push for unity, and of course we need unity. And right after the Al-Aqsa flood, there was like resounding, yes, someone just said in the comments, Palestine Solidarity Campaign 2 in the UK, of course, which has thrown Pal Action under the bus in the UK a bunch of times. But I think, of course, we need unity, and the response to build unity after the Al-Aqsa flood was correct. But it's not just unity for unity's sake. We need to build unity in our shared principles, because not all of us are in it for the same reasons. I think we need to build unity around resistance, not just abstractly supporting resistance far away, but building resistance here and supporting our resistance fighters here or wherever we find ourselves.
Yeah, no, many very important issues that you raised. I mean, one reflection that I have about this question of unity is that definitely we need to have unity to be strong enough to actually achieve political change, which is exactly why disuniting or creating fissures has always been part of the counterinsurgency tactics, since, what has sometimes been referred to as COINTELPRO. But of course, it went back so much farther than just what started to happen in the late 60s and early 70s, with domestic anti-racism and, radical workers movements. And you go all the way back to the early 20th century, the, breaking strikes and, mainstream corporate unionism acting and behaving in exactly the same way that you were talking about in terms of the NGOization and policing the boundaries of what's acceptable resistance and what's not, what's acceptable struggle and what's not. But very often, those who are actually creating the disunity, like raising the question, as you just did, is often characterized as like, disuniting by calling out some of these counterinsurgency tactics. But it's always, it seems to me, really these groups that are the ones that are disuniting what comes out as a basic spontaneous solidarity when people see what's happening in Gaza, for example, or Black Lives Matter, when there's, particularly evident and widely circulated case, because it's happening all the time. We just don't really hear about it. Case like George Floyd that just spurs like revulsion of people from their innate sense of the injustice of it. Then immediately these kind of policing tactics come in about framing what's allowable, what's not, what's considered, too far in the extreme. So the disunity comes from those who are trying to find some kind of acceptability within mainstream institutions and mainstream politics. So that just seems like, a problem to be very aware of from the beginning, and that if we're going to call for unity, then I think we need to do so in a kind of comprehensive way on the basic and fundamental principles.
Yeah, just to add on to that a little there, directly what you're saying, like it is a good thing that support for Palestine has become so mainstream and that we can't go anywhere without confronting the reality that the US is facilitating this genocide. But there also become dangers with it becoming so mainstreamed. I mean, we saw the same thing in 2020. Like Mitt Romney was going to BLM protests, and the Democrats were kneeling and taking their pictures. But with the mainstreaming, there also comes like a watering down. And so we have to be really critical of that. Like we aren't in the same movement as celebrities who are just using Palestine to build their brand and actually throwing the armed resistance under the bus. And so yeah, that's exactly what I mean about building unity, but a unity on shared principles, which may require disunifying with opportunists or liberal Zionists who claim to be part of our movement but actually should not be.
Exactly. I mean, I think what it has to be is about giving the opportunity to really educate. So we got to clarify these principles. I mean, if people are just have not developed the political consciousness to, be committed to the more universalist principles and apply them in a consistent way. Obviously, we got to speak, we got to have outreach, political consciousness, but at certain points there are decisions that have to be made, just as you said, like you have to disaffiliate from certain kinds of things. And I wanted to point out and mention, and it came up in the chat, before I've had the chance to mention it, but just like the principles for the Palestinian national resistance, a thawabit, these are ignored or not often talked about in our kind of movements in the West, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, and say the Anglophone sort of world, where you do have a variety of solidarity movements that come together, but seldom do you hear kind of from the organs and the more mainstream institutions like, say, Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, like what are the foundational core principles that have been already established that were a basis of unity. And I would recommend everybody to go check out a recent discussion by Resistance is Fertile podcast, and shout out to Benji, who was in the chat and reminded us about it, that they did an excellent episode just going through these principles and commenting on them and thinking about, like, how we have to understand these as a basis for unified resistance. So I would just recommend that for everybody. And as Benji's posted, a thawabit should be the litmus test of actual solidarity with Palestine. Anything less is just another form of colonialism. And so one issue that came up when you were talking about it is how to turn solidarity from a kind of passive activity into one where one can politically envision and organize around revolution in the belly of the beast, in the empire. I mean, there's been a lot of, I think appropriate that, of course, the lead is taken by the resistance, and people have mentioned a lot about actually validating, because there have been people who wanted to condemn the resistance, at the very beginning when there was so much pressure on everyone. But one feature of that has also been to turn it into passive solidarity, that, well, we support Palestinian right to resist. They are the leaders of this struggle, and we're just in solidarity with them, without necessarily thinking about, well, what are the obligations for solidarity, and is it just a passive kind of support that we will say we support? We will promote their kind of analysis and so on, or are there things that we could be doing to make it more of an active anti-imperialist struggle ourselves? And I'm just wondering, that tension is sometimes there in the movement, where people want to give prominence and priority to the resistance there, and they think that making these recommendations or talking about it in a certain way is transgressing upon, where the leadership of it is. So how does one really think through that? What would be your response to that set of concerns?
There's definitely no easy answers, but I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, of course, in the Palestinian national liberation struggle, it is going to be Palestinians in Palestine who are resisting that are going to win victory for Palestine. Like, it's not to overemphasize our own role in the metropole or in the imperial core or whatever you want to call it. Of course, the axis of resistance is, the tip of the spear, the global vanguard of resistance against Zionism. And that's not exclusively limited to the Arab Iranian region. I mean, like Nicolas Maduro said last year, that we are all part of an international axis of resistance. Anyone decolonizing their mind and struggling against imperialism wherever they find themselves in Africa, Asia, Latin America is part of this international axis of resistance. So it is about seeing ourselves as part of that and analyzing our own conditions as to what is to be done and where the arteries of imperialism lie, which is going to be very different if you are living in the United States versus if you are living in Lebanon or Yemen, of course. I think and this is all about what I was saying earlier, I think there is kind of a hesitancy to really analyze what is to be done here in the US. And I think kind of the siloing of Palestine as a single issue detached from the rest of the axis of resistance, the rest of the world contributes to this. I think in the US especially, of course, it's important to study movements in the global South and to study examples outside the US. But I also think there's a failure to study our own history of resistance here. And when people think of resistance in the US, they think of like CPUSA in the 30s, and they don't necessarily think of the underground armed anti-imperialist guerrilla struggles and national liberation movements. I think there's different strains of third worldism that have taken hold and like been present in this movement. And I think there is kind of a dangerous strain that like cheers on the axis of resistance from our armchairs, but takes third worldism to mean fighting is only to be done in the third world and not here. And I think that is, again, this like very passive abdication of our responsibility to resist wherever we are. And not only that, it ignores the existence of the third world in the US. It ignores the existence of national liberation struggles within the so-called United States, which is a prison house of nations, and has a very unique history of struggle. I mean, when we think of like the Palestinian resistance's concept of the unity of the fields, which denotes, unity on the front lines in resistance to Zionism, despite ideological differences, despite geographical differences. I think there's really interesting examples of that in this history of struggle in the US, where we had, Puerto Rican national liberation groups, New African national liberation organizations, white people who consider themselves traitors to the settler nation, working in concert, working together. Like, those are the groups of people that broke Assata out of prison. And so I think studying our own history here is really important. I think most importantly, seeing ourselves as part of a resistance movement, not just bystanders or observers of a resistance movement, is really important. There's a word in Arabic, a concept in the Palestinian resistance. I'm not going to say it because I don't think I'm remembering it correctly, but it means kind of the accumulation of resistance. And a lot of scholars have talked about this, like Patrick Higgins' article on the Al-Aqsa flood and US imperialism I recently read, and I thought it was fantastic. And he references this term in it. But we have to think of everything we're doing as this accumulation of experience and resistance, of experimentation and different tactics, developing the strategies that are actually going to take us to victory. We can't expect a single march or a single action or a single organization to just like make the genocide stop, or to make the US withdraw, like, or stop sending arms to Israel, like, that's not how it's going to happen. We are only going to defeat imperialism through the extremes of struggle. And I still think everything that has happened and everything we're doing is like getting us closer to there. I mean, the action I was arrested for and did jail time for, I certainly would never tell someone now to go climb on the roof of a weapons factory and smash some windows and let the police arrest you, because my life has, I mean, been like completely changed by that ever since. It's allowed me to, or it's prevented me from taking part in a lot of forms of action that I would like to. I'm on a suspended sentence where if I get arrested for anything in the next 3 years, I automatically go to prison for 2 years. So I can't do a lot of what I would like to be doing. I'm also under extreme like surveillance and repression and investigation still. So I would not tell someone to go do that now, but I still think everything we did with Pal Action, all the attempts we made, was really important to experiment with those tactics here, to see what works and what doesn't, and to get us closer to the correct tactics. And really, for me, it was facing extreme repression that got me there. Like, I was not thinking in terms of, oh, we need to build an underground. Oh, we need to be studying like the Black Liberation Army and the May 19th Communist Movement and the Puerto Rican Armed National Liberation groups at all. We were just thinking of how can we stop the bombs? How can we stop the bombs from being sent to Palestine to kill our friends? And like I said, Pal Action US was like only existed really for 6 weeks before we got hit with really heavy charges and effectively ceased to exist. Although we did continue as a propaganda platform for much, much longer and did a lot of important work that way. But it was, having to accept the fact that I might go to prison for the rest of my life that made me realize the necessity of building a movement that can not only strike blows at the state, like material blows at imperialism and at the enemy, but also a movement that can keep people out of the hands of the state and not lose people to incarceration. Because that I was facing 37 years in prison, like that, I literally could have been in prison for the rest of my life. And so we can't just think about it as like, how do we, shut down this one specific company? Like, this is how my thinking has changed. We need to think about how we can build a revolution here, and specifically build a popular cradle of resistance that can, keep resistance sustained, keep it regenerating itself. I think there's a nascent popular cradle of resistance in some places, but largely I think there's a total disconnect between organizations that have kind of appointed themselves as the movement leadership and then people who are sacrificing and are resisting. And I regret I've taken so long to even bring this up, because I know we're already like halfway through our discussion, but I really want to mention Casey Goonan and T. Hoxha's hunger strike that's going on right now. T. Hoxha is a Pal Action UK prisoner who is on her 19th day of hunger strike as of today. She is dying. Her hair is falling out. She is throwing up after she takes vitamins. She cannot like think straight. Her brain fog is getting worse. Her supporters are calling for her to urgently be transported to a hospital. And she is simply demanding fair treatment from the prison authorities, who have been abusing and targeting her and calling her a terrorist because she is alleged to have dismantled an Elbit Systems weapons factory. And 2 days ago, when Casey Goonan, the only political prisoner in the US from the student intifada, who has been incarcerated since last June for over a year now and is facing up to 20 years in federal prison with terrorism enhancement, Casey, as soon as they heard about Hoxha's strike, announced that they were joining in solidarity and would not eat until Hoxha's demands all the way over in the UK are met. And Casey's cellmate, who's just like a regular inmate, not a so-called political prisoner, is also joining. And I didn't even really know about Hoxha's hunger strike until Casey joined and internationalized it. And I've just been, thinking about them nonstop. I wrote an article about this. I'm getting it translated in different languages to share it far and wide, because no one is talking about this. There are some organizations, like in response to the illegitimate prescription of Pal Action in the UK, a lot of new groups have popped up and responded very quickly and cleverly and creatively to the ban And I would say there is much more of a mass movement around the prisoners there because of the number of prisoners that are associated with PAL Action UK and because of PAL Action UK's popularity and success and longevity. But here is not the case at all. Like Casey Goonan has largely been like very ignored by the movement, and the same goes for all the political prisoners that are facing heavy charges and a lot of time right now. There's Elias Rodriguez, of course, who assassinated 2 Zionist diplomats in the streets of Washington, D.C., which I would argue is the most powerful direct action that someone in the West has done since the Al-Aqsa flood. And there is also, Jakai McRae, Tarek Bazrouk, these other folks who are largely being ignored, but I think really deserve our support and need to be upheld and recognized by the movement. I think this is a lot of what I write about in my piece, but like looking to the Palestinian struggle and how much it centers their prisoners. The Al-Aqsa flood itself was a prison break. It was waged in order to win the release of Palestinian prisoners, which it has, and I believe will continue to win those releases. But George Abdullah, I want to say a quote from George Abdullah that he said in an interview when he was released, because I think he really like explains this in clear terms when we say like center political prisoners or our prisoners are our compass. And he said, the one who resists is the one who has the final say and determines what should and should not be done. The ultimate decision maker is the one who sacrifices himself to the resistance. All spectators have no right to discuss any topic. And I think that speaks for itself. We need to uphold the people facing repression and who are sacrificing for the resistance. And of course, like there are plenty of critiques to be made of the said actions. I've made plenty of critiques of my action. I don't think the time and place to make those critiques is necessarily when people are about to be sentenced or are still facing the charges or still locked up. But nevertheless, I think like those critiques need to be directed internally to the movement as to why there are people willing to take militant action, but there's no one there to back them up. There's no one there to sustain it, to carry it on. Why have we failed to build a popular cradle of resistance that can sustain this militancy? We shouldn't blame the people who want to resist and who are sacrificing and who are doing militancy despite the movement's failure to like build the infrastructure for that. We should be critiquing ourselves and how we have failed these people. It goes both ways. And again, this is part of our accumulation of experience in resistance. If we just ignore that these things are happening or pretend that they're not happening, how are we ever going to advance to the tactics and the strategy that we need?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, I hope to post your recent article in the description here so that people can go read about this, because I actually also, hadn't really heard about Hoxha's hunger strike until I saw, some reporting and tweets and your tweet about Casey Goonan's solidarity hunger strike. And so one point that I had wanted to make in thinking about this is that your point also about critiques. It's very important for people to recognize that, of course, these must be self-critical movements if we're to learn and become effective. But one thing that happened after your arrest with your comrades in PAL Action USA, I noticed that many people were doing the whole second guessing critique about, well, you can't do that in the US. Maybe you can do it in the UK, or the laws are so different here, or this is like such an engine of capital that any property crimes are going to be treated this way, that way. And we've got the whole terrorism law. I was amazed at how much people were able to quickly come up with all kinds of it's like, well, if you can come up with this kind of analysis, let's be talking about the right strategy then. Like if you can kind of on a dime somehow generate like this very thorough kind of sense of the problems with a certain tactic, why was this not leading to internal discussions ahead of time about what the right tactics? And that just shows the state of the movement. It was so disorganized, and that's one difference that I've noticed in PAL Action in the UK, I happened to have been there on kind of research sabbatical the year 2023, 2024.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was so much better being in the UK, despite the fact that that is also a corrupt and repressive regime, but just because there would be 1 million people in the street every couple of weekends, you know? And while that, of course, didn't have the sort of effect that it would if it was really a democracy, it nonetheless made you feel that, which I think was harder in the United States. I mean, unless you were online in certain circles, it felt very, alone in the first few weeks if you had any kind of a critique of the Zionist narratives and the erasure of history to represent this as if it just all started on October 7th, etc. But over there, what I noticed, and I attended some of the court cases in solidarity with people who had actionists who were on trial, and there was a network of people who would support. We would go, we would attend. We would show that these are not people you can isolate from the movement. We'd use it for education. There was a network, of people who are keeping track of these people. And this is something that I think is a real concern here in the U.S. is the political prisoners have been so much more isolated in the U.S. context than in many others because their people are so afraid to show solidarity. But you cannot have courageous people taking actions if there's no support network. That's one thing I noticed with PAL Action. For every actionist, there would be at least, there'd be 10 people in various support capacity. So being part of the movement doesn't mean that you have to necessarily be the one who is doing the direct action, but for it to actually be effective and sustainable and, exert pressure, you need a network of support and solidarity that does a lot of things like media around it, like, making food, showing up to trials and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's the kind of very important lesson. And a movement is judged by, how it responds to its political prisoners. Like, if you have a movement where there is solidarity, that is a strong movement for those people. But if they're isolated and subjected to repression of the state in these carceral institutions without support outside, it means there really isn't a strong movement. You have also been a political prisoner. I mean, you served, as you said, time, and you faced these 37. I thought it was 14. I didn't realize it was 37 years of possible sentences. What would you say about I mean, you've already been talking about it, but it would be, I think, valuable for people to understand what you saw that experience as teaching you, what we can all learn from it, and what ways going forward we should think about the importance of the political role of political prisoners for the movement going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I completely agree with what you said too about how every organization, every person in the movement, even people who are not doing direct action themselves, can be upholding it. Because I think that's a common misconception about those of us pushing for escalation. Like, we're not asking your grandma to go firebomb Elbit, obviously, but your grandma can show up for court to support someone who does. Militancy is not just gun-toting. Militancy is an entire politics. Also to get to what you said about how people are just like, we need to do political education. Of course, we need to do political education, but not just political education for political education's sake. Like, we need to build a political framework as to why militancy is necessary. Just yelling escalate at people is not necessarily useful. We need to build a political basis for why escalation is necessary. What is the role of revolutionaries in the imperial core? What is the dialectical relationship between our liberation struggle here and those in the global South? And what is the base for revolution here? And prison is a part of that. I mean, I'd point to sources like Safiya Bukhari or Asamni Burton, George Jackson, of really like the best political theorizations of the role of the prison and of the political prisoner, and prisons as domestic warfare, as concentration camps. Like, we're seeing this not only with just the regular US prison system, but with the vast expansion of ICE facilities, ICE concentration camps, and uprisings that are taking place within them that are being totally blacked out by the media. I mean, a couple months ago, during when everything was popping off in LA in early June, which is still popping off, by the way, it's just not getting out. But when it was really at its peak, there was an uprising in Delaney Hall in New Jersey, where inmates literally tore down the walls of this concentration camp with their bare hands, and some of them escaped, and as far as I know, have not been caught. Mm-hmm. But to get to my experience in jail, I mean, I think we are not prepared for the level of repression we are going to face. Like, we went into that action thinking we were going to get bailed out with $40 and be out that night. Because that's what had happened in Massachusetts, where I was also facing felony charges. And even though I was already out on bail for another action when I got arrested at New Hampshire, like, we did not think the stakes would just get so high that quickly. And not only that, we were given no contact orders, which is a repressive tactic meant to tear social networks apart and fracture support systems and make political coordination as difficult as possible. But thankfully, I did get out on bail, $20,000 cash bail. So I was only locked up for like those 3 initial days, but they were trying to hold us without bail. And my public defender basically said to me, like, look, you're already out on bail. You're probably not going to get bail this time. You're probably going to be locked up until your trial, and you're facing 37 years. So that was a reality that felt like I had to accept until we did get bail. And then it was about a year until we served our sentence. And the first plea offers we got were like 1 to 2 years. So of course the charges immediately dropped down. But the point of hitting people with such extreme charges to begin with is to get you to flip, to get you to rat on your comrades. And so it's important for people, if you're the person facing charges, to like stay clear-headed and remember that these are just intimidation tactics and that the charges usually don't stick in the end. But also for people on the outside, as you mentioned, there was an insane response to me getting arrested online, even from like my personal friends and comrades, or people who I thought were my personal friends and comrades. I got out and people were talking about me like I was dead. Like, people had just accepted that I would do the time or like be stuck in prison for the rest of my life, which I think is extremely defeatist. And I think it is part of this culture that treats prisoners as if they are dead. And like, yeah, prison is social death in a lot of ways, but prisoners are not dead. Prison is a site of struggle. As Jonathan Jackson Jr., the nephew of George Jackson, the son of Jonathan Jackson, said in an interview I did with him earlier this year, when I asked about prison as a site of struggle, he said, no, prison is the site of struggle. And I think in the US that is especially the case because prison is the modern evolution of slavery, chattel slavery. And so the time inside, we did 40 days total. We got a 60-day sentence, and then with good behavior, it's like you do 2/3 of the time. So we went in November, we got out right before Christmas. I mean, we knew when we were going in and when we were getting out, so I could like count down the days. What had driven me crazy about being inside before is not knowing if I would ever get out. And so I really like can only speak to that short experience. I can't speak to what it's actually like to be inside for years, decades, a lifetime, which is the reality that so many people are facing who don't have a voice or a platform at all. And so that's why I feel the need to shout them out. Again, like, we'll drop the links to make calls to support the hunger strikers, and those are on my Twitter and stuff. It's super fast to email, to call, and to build pressure. And there's also a lot of fundraisers going around to support these people. But yeah, I mean, we like read books, we played cards, we were friends with basically everyone on our unit. Like, people were really friendly, people were really curious why we were inside and what we'd done. And once we explained to people, they were like, oh, that's awesome. Like, next time bring us to fuck up an Elbit with you. So people were very supportive, like people who'd never heard of Palestine before. It was just logical to them that a weapons factory committing genocide, massacring children, should be attacked. And so we did a lot of informal political education when we were inside, and people were very receptive to it, and were sad when we left. Like, we built really strong community. And so that's another thing, is like treating prisoners like they're dead. There is life inside. There is forms of life that persist despite all the brutality and attempts to like crush your spirit. And I really think that, like, of course, I think people should avoid arrest at whatever cost, but I do think a lot of people, the experience of getting arrested, of being in jail, is radicalizing. And especially like the petty bourgeois people that mostly make up the movement, including myself, like, that is not somewhere you would otherwise likely find yourself, if not for political actions. I think there's a huge debate in the political prisoners movement about whether all prisoners are political prisoners. And I think I have said that before in the past, like, all prisoners are political prisoners, because it's a catchy phrase, but I don't actually think that is true, in the sense that, like, I do believe all prisoners are in prison for political reasons, because of political systems, because of policies that exist. But that doesn't mean every prisoner is a politically conscious prisoner who is in there because of their own political actions. And those are two very different things. And then there's also like George Jackson's, the people who become politicized once they're inside for completely different reasons, and then become targeted for their politics. So I think that's something worth mentioning. I mean, there's really interesting debate. Like, Safiya Bukhari, founder of the Jericho movement, was one of the people who put forth that all prisoners are political prisoners. There was a panel recently I saw clips of on social media with Jihad Abdul Mamit, who's one of the Jericho leaders now, and he was saying, like, no, not all prisoners are political prisoners. Like, don't put me in the same box as like a rapist or someone who was hurting our community. So I think that is like an important distinction to make as well. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be organizing around people who aren't inside for political reasons, who aren't like political prisoners in the traditional sense, because those are still the people organizing and uprising in these facilities. I already referenced like the ICE concentration camp uprising at Delaney Hall. There was one in Alcatraz, which I feel ridiculous even saying that. I think yesterday or today, that is ongoing, and that there's been like horrific brutality in response to. There's also been a lot of organizing in Alabama prisons, which are notoriously the most brutal and racist in the country. And workers like forming, like, kind of unionizing and going on strike against the prison labor / slavery system. So yeah, I wonder what else do I have to say? I mean, I think like having a support team when we were inside made the experience so much better. Of course, like, most people who were inside with us were not getting written to by anyone, visited by anyone, whereas we were getting letters every single day. We were getting books, although the books were heavily censored. And like, I mean, you tried to send me books.
The books I tried to send you didn't make it. They sent them back. Yeah. So they didn't.
Yeah, I got they kept some of them and gave them to me when I got out. So I got like a stack when I got out of books that they said were terrorist shit, was the term that the sergeant used, but they gave them to me, some of them, when I was released. And so now I have like a little stack of those books, and they're all like branded with my criminal control number. But yeah, that made a big difference. And we also reached a point though where we were getting so many letters, and we were like, we're getting out in a couple weeks, that we asked our supporters to organize events for long-term political prisoners, people who aren't getting as much attention, people who are in there for life sentences, because that was important to us. Just because our case got attention, we were getting written to, but we felt the need to use that to like politicize people more. Also, when we were in jail, a lot happened. I mean, the ceasefire in Lebanon happened, of course, which has been violated every single day since. And then immediately after that, the collapse of Syria's sovereignty. And that was just insane to watch on a jail TV through CNN. I mean, of course, they've been trying to do regime change in Syria for over a decade. And so when I saw that initially, I thought not much of it. And then I got a message just being like, Syria fell. And I remember us even before we got the news that, you know, the government had fully collapsed, like I sent a message through the tablet to our support group, because we were always sending messages on the tablets to be put on Twitter, to be passed on to the group chats. And I put out a message just saying how, you know, important it was. I felt that people stand against the regime change in Syria, and that they support the axis of resistance, especially, you know, the states that the US has been trying to demonize and overthrow, and that unfortunately many people on the left and in the Palestine movement fall for that regime change propaganda. And so we put out messages communicating that. Also, Luigi allegedly did his assassination when we were in jail, and we were getting updates and reading the newspaper about that, and we were all watching, all the girls and us were watching on TV when he got caught, and we were cheering for him. And again, everyone in jail just thought it was very logical, what to support him, just like they did to support our action, because these are people who are already, even if they're not politicized, they're just so brutalized and living the worst realities of the system that we live in, that supporting resistance is more immediately logical to them, and they're already living in subversion of the system, or living undergrounds, not political undergrounds, but the undergrounds that are created by capitalism, by necessity.
Yeah, really, I mean, so interesting to hear from you about these very significant experiences and the insights that you have about them, in just the same way that we were just speaking about the way in which political prisoners are reflective of the dynamics of the whole movement, and they shouldn't be understood just in isolation as separate individuals from this broader movement, and we need to create those lines of solidarity and support, and the way in which that is a site of resistance. And you mentioned, the importance of the, Al-Aqsa flood was really, built around the goal of liberating political prisoners. And I think for many people in contexts where they're not familiar with the need to maintain that sense of solidarity with political prisoners of the movement, almost like a sacred kind of duty of a movement, it may not have made sense. Why are they, kind of just trying to, what kind of a goal is this to just get the, people liberated from these prisons? And, it may have seemed like maybe it wasn't the most effective kind of thing to act on and bargain for. But I think your comments and your experience, what you've been saying, really, I think, brings a new insight to that. But in just the same way, you also had mentioned earlier that looking at Palestine as just a single issue kind of question, you just were talking about witnessing what happened while you were in prison across the axis of resistance, with the Lebanon ceasefire, the Syria kind of government's collapse. And so that's, I think, something that I've noticed as well, is that many people will express their solidarity for justice for Palestinians. But when you have Yemen taking actions, or Hezbollah taking actions in support and solidarity, but especially and above all, when Iran takes actions in solidarity, or is made an object of an attack, of Israeli aggressive attack, it sort of derails and short circuits for many people the way in which these are actually intimately connected, and can often be a distraction. I remember that a lot of the discourse about the, it's ramped up as the starvation, the deliberate starving of Gazans has increased. But when the 12-day war, as it's sometimes called, of Israel and U.S. attack on Iran happened, there was building political pressure because of the dire conditions of the people in Gaza suffering starvation under the blockade and siege. And it got completely derailed in some ways. It was off the front pages, and people couldn't have, it seemed, the same sort of sympathy with Iranians as victims of American imperialist aggression. And you recently went to Iran, and so I want to have a chance to hear a little bit more about your experience and reflections on what it was like to visit Iran and to make some of those connections for the Palestine solidarity movement and community, about really integrating into their analysis the resistance that Iran has offered, and what we should kind of learn, and how we need to be in solidarity with them as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the context and how you went, and then, tell us a little bit more about what you observed.
Yeah, so I went to Iran. We stayed just in Tehran, in the capital, for a week in mid-July. It was just a couple weeks after the ceasefire, after the 12-day imposed war, the U.S. Zionist aggression. And the purpose of the trip, it was the first group of foreign journalists that were allowed into Iran since the war, to report on the destruction that was caused, especially the targeting of journalists and the Iranian state broadcasting headquarters, and civilian sites. So that was mostly what we were visiting. But of course, like what I emphasized in my article, reflecting on the trip, and kind of giving an overview, is that it is just important to condemn the attacks on the military facilities, on military personnel, as it is to condemn the attacks on civilians, because all of these attacks, and the attempts to dismantle the Iranian state, are attacks on not only the Iranian people, but like all the people of the axis of resistance and all people in the entire world interested in liberation. And I think the Islamic Revolution of 1979 should be studied and upheld, just like we talk about, the communist revolutions of the 20th century, because it was not merely a cultural or spiritual or religious phenomenon. It was also a social revolution, an anti-imperialist revolution. And so not only were we seeing the current day impacts of U.S. imperialism on Iran, U.S. Zionist imperialism or U.S.-led imperialism, but also seeing a lot of the history of this struggle for over half a century. Going to the former U.S. embassy, was really, really incredible. I described that in my article about Iran's internationalism, having a room where Mao, Che, Fidel, Malcolm X, Sitting Bull are all honored. It's impossible to describe, but I think there is this huge disconnect, in the way we talk about even other countries in the global south that we don't with Iran. I think Iran really is the most misunderstood country in the world, along with the DPRK, and the occupation of the US embassy in Iran by the Iranian student movement. That was arguably the most powerful student direct action in the history of the world. And as we've seen this resurgence of the student movement, of building occupations, being there, I was like, why are we not studying this tactically, politically? I think Iranians have a really deep understanding of U.S. imperialism as well, and the contradictions within U.S. society. Of course, Margbar America, Margbar Israel is a chant in Iran. I went viral for saying that there. And there's a lot of emphasis from Iranians that this is a chant directed at the ruling class, not the U.S. people, which sometimes I think is a little too generous, because the U.S. people have continued building and sending the bombs this entire genocide. But during the embassy occupation, they first released the Black hostages and the women hostages to show their understanding of oppression in the U.S. And the Supreme Leader has directed many letters directly to Western youth, directing messages to Western youth, about the reality of settler colonialism and genocide in the West, and the guilt that these nations feel because of that, their kind of inherent violence, encouraging them to study the Quran, to study Iranian history, to work towards peace, specifically like releasing those statements in moments like the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. What else is there to say? I mean, back to what I was saying earlier about like this distinction between the regime and the people, which is a false distinction. And Max Eil wrote a great article about exactly this, because you can't like separate the two. These attacks on the regime were meant to overthrow the regime and therefore, ruin the lives of the entire Iranian people, de-develop Iran, open it up to the same exact kind of genocidal violence and sectarianism that we're seeing right now in Syria. That is what they want to do to Iran. And one of the most powerful places that we visited on the trip was the Evin Detention Center, which had the highest number of casualties of the entire attack. I believe it was like up to 100 people were killed there. Prisoners, prison staff, families of people of visiting their family members in prison, medical workers, like all of the above killed in this attack on this detention center, which, and as characterized in the West, is like the most brutal prison in the world. That is how the West characterizes this facility. I haven't talked about this publicly at all, because like it's nuanced, of course. I mean, I think prisons, like everywhere, there's probably people who don't deserve to be in there. And of course, when I was standing in the rubble of this prison and also the hospital of this prison that was also bombarded, complete wreckage. I mean, you could see like blood streaks. You could see all this destroyed medical equipment, medical records, children's toys, people's hats, people's purses in the rubble. I could see myself in all those people and sympathize with all those people. And I think it goes a lot to say that even like prisoners of the Iranian government, their primary enemy is the Zionist entity and US imperialism. That is the entity that massacred those people, not the Iranian government itself. And so that was really powerful, because that was my first time in a prisoner jail besides the one that I was in. And so of course I saw myself in that position. And I think that example just like exposes a lot about the misconceptions of these narratives about Iran. I mean, very much like daily life was going about as usual. People in Iran are used to living in a constant threat of outside aggression and attacks. When I got back, it became very clear again how many misconceptions people have in the West about Iran. I mean, people were asking me like, oh, aren't women not allowed to drive there? Which is actually Saudi Arabia, where women were not allowed to drive for a long time. And I found out in Ukraine, women weren't allowed to drive like certain trucks and vehicles, but certainly not in Iran, where I saw women driving everywhere, and women in very high positions and very respected positions of authority, and treated very well. I mean, the national hero of the 12-day imposed war is Sahar Amami, the journalist who was on air when the IRIB headquarters was struck with 11 Zionist missiles. And we visited the wreckage of that building. It was absolutely horrific. And even I, as someone who like, I consider myself up to date on the news, I follow these things pretty closely. I had no idea the extent of the destruction. I hadn't even seen the full images of the attacks on this building, because there has been such a complete media blackout in the West. And meanwhile, we have organizations in the West releasing statements during these attacks saying like, we stand against Zionist fascism and Iranian fascism, and making all these, like mental gymnastics as if there is somehow a position where you can stand against Zionism, but also stand for the overthrow of the main entity resisting it, and propping up the axis of resistance, which is not to say like the other members of the axis of resistance are just Iranian props or like assets, but it is a reality that Iran, as a state, is like the main bulwark against imperialism and Zionism in this region since the Islamic Revolution. And I mean, I know you know all this and you probably have a lot more expertise on me, but being there and just standing in the rubble after years of just watching videos and seeing this live streamed, it's impossible to put into words. I've never been in a war zone before. Most of the other journalists on that trip have lived in war zones or have lived in countries bombarded by US and Zionist imperialism. And so it was very transformative and powerful to be there. And I think, and this is the message I put out in my article, but the main feeling I came away with was optimism, because that was the sentiment that so many people in Iran shared with me. And like, people literally said word for word, like, we can't wait for the war to start again so we can strike Israel. And, we're glad we finally had a chance to hit them back. And so that is real. Like, there is a readiness and a pride and hope in the resistance. And of course, Iran is an incredibly complex society that's full of contradictions, like any society. And so like today or yesterday, because of these snapback sanctions triggered by the UN with the failure of the nuclear negotiations, which we could get way more into, but probably don't have time for. But there's, of course, bills being drafted in the Iranian parliament to actually develop, a nuclear weapon and to withdraw from all the nuclear non-proliferation treaties and to end cooperation with the IAEA. If I'm saying that acronym correctly. And so, like, Iran has to balance these debates within its society. Like, the official position is, of course, the supreme leader has a fatwa against the development of a nuclear weapon. The nuclear reactors that are in Iran, the US started that program with the Shah. The US started that program and wanted to build way more. And so that is the official position. And I believe that. I believe that all the research in nuclear development is purely for scientific, civilian purposes. But at the same time, I think if people in Iran want a nuclear bomb, then I absolutely support that. For the same reason I support the DPRK having one. And so, like I said, the Iranian government is having to, like, balance all these internal debates within its own society and how people feel about the path forward and how much further negotiation should be done with the West at all at this point, when it's shown, absolute disgrace for any negotiations. The negotiations were a trick to get Iran to let its guard down so that they could strike in the middle of them. And that was something that was said to us as well, is that, there is negative trust in the US and the West right now. But still, there has been a continued negotiating with allies of the US and the Zionist entity. And now it's going to be a decisive moment as to whether that continues or whether, I think the war is going to start again soon. And the encroachments in Syria and Lebanon, the impending attempt to disarm Hezbollah, the escalation against Yemen and strikes or attempted assassinations of its leaders, which of course failed, but like should be taken seriously. It's definitely really heating up again. And those of us outside the region have to think about how we're going to escalate here in response to continued escalating. We saw how devastating the collapse of Syria was. We can't let that happen to Iran or anywhere.
Indeed. Well, it's a disaster if it happens to Iran. It was bad enough that it happened not only for the people of Syria, but also broadly for the anti-imperialist struggle in West Asia and the entire region. That was very significant. I've had a friend and colleague, David Yagoubian, on in a previous office hours. He's an Iran historian, specialist of Iran, and he thinks that it's not imminent because of what happened in the 12-day war. And but everything I feel and read about how insane and irrational the will to expand and the fascistic kind of ideology behind this greater Israel project and US imperialism just makes me think that rational deterrence may not, itself be enough to forestall another attack soon. Like you, I mean, I fear that perhaps it might be directed at Lebanon first because, the resistance there has rebuilt a lot of capacity, and also very much, in terms of its political stance, is very popular, and it's very difficult for this kind of puppet, regime that's sort of been manufactured, particularly the Prime Minister Nawaf Salam being kind of imposed upon Lebanon, plucked from the ICJ, and sent to lead the government in Lebanon. That their capacity, it seems, to actually accomplish the goals of U.S. and Israeli ambition in the region to disarm the resistance are probably not going to work. And what that means is that external forces will have to be, external force will have to be used. So perhaps that's more imminent. We don't know. But I think the lessons that you learned about the confidence of the people of Iran, I mean, this is something that we talked about, is that how important the new kind of sense of national kind of solidarity emerged. And of course, there's so many contradictions in Iran, many of which were attempted to be exploited effectively for regime change, which seemed to be the real goal, not, of course, the nuclear program, but to actually use the inspection regime under this horrible Rafael Grossi figure, who heads the IAEA, to subvert, Iran's regime. I keep saying regime, the government of Iran, for so-called regime change. But what you were pointing out, what's happening right now, that shows the contradictions. It's a complex society, is the fact that they had passed in Parliament a refusal to work with the IAEA again, and yet the government is, it seems, allowing a new visit. That visit was supposed to trigger, if there are snapback provisions, that's supposed to trigger, according to the Parliament, withdrawal from the NPT. So, we're at a crossroads. We're at a very important moment right now in Iranian politics. And for many people, they would have no comprehension of the fact that there are multiple different factions and orientations and a great diversity of opinions that can be discussed publicly and debated, in Iran's political culture. And almost more important for a U.S. or a kind of audience in the imperial West than any position we might take about whether we support Iran going nuclear, withdrawing from the NPT, etc., is to recognize that they are a sovereign nation with their own political debates and discussions. And we are not privy to this. And we've constructed an inimical and hostile and cartoonish view of Iranian society. So your, trip is just further kind of evidence for having to take into account the realities that are we're prevented from really seeing. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of people really didn't want me to go,
It
and
was
were mad that I
controversial.
went,
That's right.
including people who claim to support Iran and the axis of resistance, but thought I shouldn't go, thought it was too dangerous, thought it was too risky. And I felt like it was important to go for the same reason I think it's important, like, to travel to Cuba and to any sanctioned country or so-called state-sponsored terrorism or people resisting imperialism. But lots of people go to Cuba. Lots of communists in the US have been to Cuba. Not that many people have been to Iran, especially not right after, US Zionist aggression. And I felt like it was very important to go, not only to observe, but also to express that there's people in the US, young people, who stand with them, and to bring what I learned there back here. I thought of another thing I wanted to mention, and I said IEAE, but it's IEAE. I said IAEA or something. But anyways, we visited one of the, atomic research facilities, and everything in the part we displayed, it was cancer medications. It was radiopharmaceuticals, which is another similarity to Cuba, which has had to develop its entire own indigenous production capacity for cancer medications that the US is deliberately blockading, leaving thousands of people to die. And so Iran has to do the same thing. It has to innovate its own medicines. And that is a huge goal of the nuclear program. And we visited all these apartment buildings where nuclear scientists, their entire families, their neighbors were massacred in the middle of the night, destroying entire apartment buildings. And like some of these doctors, one of the doctors specifically that was killed was close to reaching another cure for cancer, like months away from releasing this. And so I truly think that the Iranian nuclear scientists are heroes, and they're fulfilling, a duty to their entire people, an incredibly risky one. And these assassination attempts aren't new. I mean, the Zionist entity has done this for decades in various horrific forms. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been a continuing policy, and it's just more dramatic in that it happened in a kind of coordinated way with also these other attacks. We're sort of coming towards the end of our conversation. Firstly, of course, I want to thank you so much for speaking with me. But before maybe a final kind of question for you, I just want to encourage everyone to like the video and share it. I mean, what we've been discussing here, I think is really vital for our movement, and I hope you will share it with comrades, colleagues, friends, even enemies. They need to know. So, share it and subscribe to the channel. Maybe just as a kind of last point on which to end, I had a question which I think really just recapitulates and puts into focus, crystallizing, the kind of practical component that we've been wondering about in terms of our movements and action and activism. I had a question from a patron named Ricky, who is very good about always posting a question. So I definitely don't want to miss this. And he wrote to me, I think a lot about what we all need to be doing in the metropole, and feel like educating and spreading political consciousness is the stage we're at right now to help build a foundation for a vanguard party of tomorrow. And I would love to hear you two address the question everyone has. What can I do? And I guess I would also frame it as, what can we do? What must we do?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. It was a great discussion, and I think that's a good question to leave off at. There's not one answer for everyone, because everyone has different skills and different positionalities and finds themselves in different places. It really depends. Like, if I could go back and do something differently, it would be to not have a super public profile attached to my face and my legal name and all of my political activities. But that is a choice I made when I was 15 years old that's kind of irreversible. And so even as I've done more kind of clandestine direct action activity, I have always continued to have a platform and to use that to speak very publicly. But that is not something I would tell most people to do. I think preserving your anonymity and to a degree in the eyes of the state is important if you are interested in partaking in resistance. I think, as we were talking about earlier, militancy is a political framework that anyone can embody and uphold and carry out, even if you are not the one holding a gun. And I think a lot of people understand that in terms of upholding and following the Palestinian resistance, but also thinking about who are our freedom fighters here, who is resisting here, who has made sacrifices, who is locked up right now. How can we be supporting them? Because it is in that support system where the popular cradle blossoms. And we've seen that historically, how a lot of, guerrilla movements, militant movements have built their strength, or new generations have come out of the prisoner solidarity movements. The Red Army faction is a great example of that, but also how the BLA formed out of the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, in response to the repression that they were facing. So I know I'm not giving a clear answer on what is to be done, but I think we need to rethink who we look to for leadership. The people, the pundits, the media personalities, the NGO leaders, the journalists, like they can have great analysis, they can be right about things, they can be useful, but are those leaders, are people whose careers are paid for by doing this kind of work and like being a nonprofit organizer, are those your leaders? I think a lot of people have this impetus to act, but are like waiting to be told how to act, or looking to like an NGO to tell them how to do that. And I think actually we need to like look to the people around us in our community, our closest people, and build from there, build from the ground up. And like I really agree with like Grace Lee Boggs and her piece Organization Means Commitment, which everyone should read. I think that's a great like here's your actual like step-by-step ways to like start. But you know, people are always like join an organization, join an organization. And obviously I think people should be organized, but I think just yelling at people join an organization is not very useful, especially when a lot of these organizations are opportunistic or straight up counterinsurgent. So I think like starting, and what she says in this piece is starting with just one or two other people who you were on the same page with and have, you know, really close shared principles and unity, is going to be a lot more effective than organizing with 100 people who are not on the same page about anything. Like, how are you going to get anywhere? So I do agree that continued education and study is a lot of the phase that we're in and have been in, but it's like, what is the education, that what is the substance of that? Because I don't think we need like Palestine 101 teach-ins for years and years and years more. We need to also develop tactical skills on what is necessary. We need to think about how we're going to withstand repression. We need to understand fascism in the US and how it's been here for well before when Trump was elected. And again, I think the place where you can find the answers the most is in a lot of this like counter repression work and prisoner support work, because the people who are being repressed the most are usually the people that pose the biggest threat to the state. So if you want to look at what's effective in scaring and threatening the state, that's where you look. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah,
But yeah, just want to reiterate for people to share the call to pressure HMP Peterborough to meet these demands of the PAL Action UK prisoner, one of the Filton 24, to save not only her life, but Casey's life. And the probably more prisoners will join this hunger strike as it's internationalizing. So get the word out wherever you can, because there, again, is like a media blackout.
Yes, absolutely. And I would definitely want to put the link to your article and resources for solidarity with Casey Goonan and to Hoxha. And also your article on Iran, your impressions. Unfortunately, I'm such a Gen Xer and, absent-minded professor type that I wasn't able to figure out how to share the screen of your article, but I'll put the link in and people should read that and check it out. But just as a sort of final thing is just what you've been saying here. I think the prisoners, that's a really good place to start for people. There's a lot of solidarity that's needed and a lot of things people can do that is militant, as you're saying, without it necessarily meaning that the image that you have, that people have in their mind, it requires that. And right now we are at a stage where there is so much revulsion and disgust and disillusion with established institutions because of what they're allowing to, and not even just allowing, but actively engaged in perpetuating a genocide in Gaza, that there is so much possibility, it seems, if it could be put to effective political purpose. And so what you're asking us to do is find our ways to do that, to think about what you and a few others of close comrades and companions can do to forward the struggle, to put political pressure, and to mobilize and set examples for this mass movement that needs to be a revolutionary transformation. So, I will also put links to other prisoner solidarity groups, in this. And again, I just want to thank you so much, Calla, for taking some time for the example that you set for people. May not be one that everyone can exactly, reproduce, and you yourself said you might do things differently and so on, but that the example of being committed to militant and revolutionary transformation is something that we all have a part to play in. And you've been a wonderful kind of an inspiring example for people, and giving people some sense of hope and some practical ideas also as we end this conversation about taking your action forward against genocide and empire. There's a lot of work that we have to do. And I hope you'll come back and talk about other topics and issues. I really value your perspective, based not only on real serious thought and theoretical concern and consideration, but also on experience in the struggle. So I thank you so much, Calla, for joining us and speaking with me and my audience.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, I just want to say before we hop off, I know I might not be the typical guest or as educated or have as many degrees as the typical guest. I mean, I've done 1 year of college and then dropped out, and I'm trying to go back to school. But I mean, everything I've learned is through experience and through trying things myself. There's not a tactic I condemn that I haven't put into practice myself and learned from. And so I appreciate being given the platform, because our ideas, like the ideas that I've come to, have been tested in the flames of practice and on the front lines. And just reading and studying like can't compare to that. We need to be putting our ideas into practice. As Che said, words are beautiful, but action is supreme. And so thanks for giving me the chance to share some of that.
Oh, my pleasure. And, I would take you over probably 99.9% of my colleagues. So even though I bring some of them on because that's many who I know, it's not really about the degrees, but it's about the analysis and the character and the commitment. And so, again, I just really have benefited from this myself personally. And we'll also put out your Substack as well, that I think had those resources, and so people can support those movements and the call that you've put out. Again, I want to thank everybody who's joined in the live chat, whether you've been on Twitter or you've come into the YouTube live chat. I like it when people come in there and they can put in their comments. I've tried to highlight some of them. It's been a really lively conversation there in the chat, and some points that have been raised that we tried to bring into the conversation. So I thank you for making it a more vibrant and meaningful discussion. And to all of you, I wish you, peace with justice and solidarity.
Peace.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.